Excellent. Well, thank you very much. It's just terrific to be here at this incredible event. And boy, how the world has changed about nuclear power. Now we have a declaration, more than a declaration, a lot of action around tripling nuclear power. This panel is about the financing part of this and how do we think about really making progress on the financing. So I'm going to start with some questions, and we're going to open it up for a more general comment. But I just want to make one introductory comment, which is that everything that is interesting in deep decarbonization is capital intensive. Certainly that is true for nuclear power, but that's true for essentially all of the energy systems. And so we have to pay, all of this is talk unless we find ways of delivering capital to real projects. And so I want to maybe start on the capital side. We have folks up here who have been investing in financing in various ways, folks who've been building projects and running projects, new technology, and then representation from the data centers, and clearly one of the most interesting new loads here. So it's a tremendous opportunity to think about how the system as a whole is working. So maybe I can start with you, Romina. Tell us what Crédit Agricole's role has been in financing nuclear power, and how has that changed?
Definitely. So I look at this three different ways. First and foremost, our role is our commitment. And at Crédit Agricole, like many of the other banks in the room today, we have a commitment to increase by 80% in 2025 our financing of clean energy. Question, of course, is nuclear included in that actual commitment? And it is. And so while the commitment is underpinning all of our decisions on, therefore, how does our financing look? The second is the actual financing of these assets, of these companies, and how do we ensure that not only are we creating our financing opportunities that are going to help us propel towards our commitment, but we are making those accessible to our clients. Whether that be project finance within revolving credit facilities, but it goes beyond the financing that we're providing our clients. It's the underwriting of the debt for many of these projects and the corporates. And then the final way I view the financing and the commitments is what is our position within thought leadership in the space. So before I take a look at what does it look like going forward, I do think it's important to keep in mind where were we 5 years ago in the context of nuclear and sustainable finance. The earlier panel alluded to the EU taxonomy. In 2018, the discussions around the inclusion of nuclear to the EU taxonomy were just starting, and that was a multi-year process until in the summer of 2022, the EU taxonomy then decided, yes, we are including nuclear in that transitionary category. And that was a catalyst that had huge implications in the sustainable finance market, whether it be issuances from EDF that we'll hear about at Crédit Agricole. In our 2023 update of our green bond framework, we then included nuclear. So now we can issue our own Crédit Agricole notes that include nuclear, but it doesn't stop there. I mentioned thought leadership. What else does that mean? I very much see it as a combination of financing, but also investors. What role does an investment bank play with the investor community? I believe it's critical to have that dialogue with the investor base. It's a multi-year process. One deal that I'll bring up in this question, but also allude to further in our dialogue, is Constellation Energy's green bond. This year in the spring, we acted as an ESG advisor to Constellation Energy, which did a $900 million USD deal, largely to finance nuclear activity. And what did that take to get to that point? It was months of ESG investors sounding, not only with the investors, but also the other market participants in the space, the second-party opinion provider, an environmental consultant who's going to opine on the deal. How does the investment bank act as this middle ground between investors, our issuers, who we're underwriting deals for, but the entire value chain? And that encompasses so many other market participants that have to coalesce around how do we finance this in a credible way, of course, with the proper E&S risk management, but bring that market forward.
Yeah, and I want to come back later and talk about, what's ESG, what's green bonds, and what's just bonds, what's just finance, because it seems like that's what's going to be essential to make it scale. But next I want to bring in Mohamed. Tell us, one of the things that's clearly changed in the finance world is not just attention to climate and lots of statements and so on, but projects that work. You lead a company that has plausibly the most successful large nuclear project in the world right now. You've gone from 0 in 2009, you had a 1, 2, 3 agreement signed, contract let out with a Korean supplier, and then 14 years later, you have 4 gigantic reactors operational. You're embedded in the WANO system, embedded in the IMPO system. It's 0 to a 60 in breakneck pace. And so I'm curious, what's the secret sauce that you have, and do you see a lot of other places with that secret sauce?
Dave, that's a great question. Before I answer you, I would just put you on the spot here. We met.
My job is to ask the tough questions.
We met in 2011, by the way, in Davos, in World Economic Forum, and at that time I was the chairman of the World Energy Security, group, and we were looking at, how do we solve world energy security, and the lessons learned from that. There's every country have its own unique circumstances. Even looking at the U.S., each state has its own pockets of different network and gas and the availability of this and that. So it's a very complex equation. But my question to you, did you believe what I told you in 2011?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Because
that's a good start.
I didn't. Can I just say why I didn't, since you've put the question to me? Because this business is full of people saying things. And when you need to say things and then turn them into real projects, which means ultimately finance them, it hinges on credibility. And at that point, it wasn't clear whether you were going to really do the project or not do the project. You were still in the early stages of going 0 to 60 at breakneck pace. And so to me, this is why what you've done is so interesting, is because there are lots of people saying lots of things. There are lots of targets that will be abandoned in the coming years and so on. But what's going to really make tripling happen is credibility.
Mm-hmm. So back to your question, is that for UAE specifically, there was a clear vision. We want to decarbonize. We want to diversify our energy sources. And as you asked me, I remember specifically saying, why would an oil and gas country rich will go with nuclear? It's complex, it's big, and it's mega projects. This is what we do in UAE. We do complex projects. The oil and gas projects we do will peak around 35,000 people will be on the construction site. Our Baraka power plant, we had around 22,000 people on the construction site. We are good at big projects, at mega projects. Now going to the success recipe is having clear vision, clear policy, and sticking to it. This is something which has been one of the key success factors. Also, UAE is a country which is friendly with many nations that we managed to tap into their supply chain, into their resources. And I remember even when I went to financing, we went to the big banks to ask them, can we finance those projects? And I always get said, maybe we'll come back to you. And I still remember when we engaged with some of the banks, the list of risks they were showing us, bigger than the opportunity that they were seeing in those projects. So I'm okay, why should I even invest my time? And I'll use another word, sorry. Why would I even waste my time and sit with them? Because they don't understand the risks and the complexities of those projects. But today, since we did walk the path as in the UAE, from, as you said, from 0 to 60, from nothing to having 4 reactors today, operational, around 40 terawatt hours, by the way, is being produced as we speak right now here of clean energy in the UAE. It's bringing a lot of industries to the UAE to come and set up shops, from data centers, AI, to oil and gas industries. They can declare that they decarbonize their, our ADNOC company kind of prides itself by having the cleanest barrel of oil in the world, by using nuclear electricity to explore and also to break the carbons and have byproducts, which are the cleanest sources of energy. So it's a great success, but I cannot give you a specific kind of answer that can everybody use in this room. But if I summarize it, there's a clear policy, clear vision, starting really ahead of time. I gave the example, what would convince a professor to teach nuclear fission than nuclear fusion in his or her classroom? That's where they start. Talent development, human capital development. Then comes the rest of it, from technology selection, from how to build it, the construction workforce, the welders, the capabilities. That will come along immediately after the clarity of vision and direction from the either ultra scalers, the ultra demand, who have trillions of, if they come together and create a coalition, to the technology providers. One thing I would like to, before I don't want to dominate the panel here, but one important point, each phase of this project has different risks, different success factors, and different recipes. It's not just an OEM company says, I'm going to build it, and you guys now use it. These are complex technologies, and when it comes to the Gen 3 reactors that we build in the UAE, these are big projects. And you needed to have a single owner that can see it through from A to Z, that understand the risk, that manage the risk, and mitigate the risk, and communicate the risk at each phase of this project to different key stakeholders in that journey.
Let me ask you, Carine, you're in the same business, but EDF is looking at projects all around the world. You have projects obviously in France. You're involved in the UK project. You've been involved in a number of export projects. Mohamed was talking about this long list of risks that bankers are seeing when you go to finance them. How do you see the expansion of the industry from an EDF perspective, and how are you going to finance it?
Maybe just important to step back, because we've gone a long way, as it was said. Back in 2018, when we started to talk about taxonomy, nobody was fighting for nuclear, okay, nobody. But here we are today, after the energy crisis as well, which happened in 2022, the taxonomy, as was mentioned, and we just come back to the figures, which is we don't have the luxury to not use one of the technology that will decarbonize the world. So today, EDF is the largest producer of electricity in the world without direct CO2 emission. So it's a huge responsibility for us if we want to succeed in the net zero. When banks buy sovereign bond for France, they buy EDF implied temperature rise. My implied temperature rise is 1.3 degrees. Okay, so we are Paris aligned, which is not the case of where we are heading today in the global economy, right? So we need nuclear to do the net zero, there is no doubt about it. But for us to succeed, we need to face three challenges. One is, as was mentioned, how do we industrialize the ecosystem? Because the reality is that for us in France, we didn't build for 20 years. For 20 years, there was no new nuclear. So we have to rebuild completely the ecosystem, which we have done. So now we are owner of Framatome, of GE Arabelle turbines. So we have integrated the key components to succeed. The second is to bring all the ecosystem together. So we have 220,000 employees in the nuclear industry in France. We will recruit 100,000 people in the next 10 years. So we need the skill. So that's the second challenge, is the people. We are actually creating welding schools because we don't have enough people to weld. So this is a reality that it takes time as well. You have to go in the school, you have to motivate women, by the way, to join the industry as well, because we lack women in the industry. And the third challenge is how to basically cope with the failure in the market. And there are three market failures. I think Sama mentioned it. The electricity market failure. If we don't have visibility on revenues, when you invest for 80 years or 100 years, which we hope we will do, there is no way you can attract investors. The second is political and regulatory failure. Government change, policy change. We can't allow that. It has to be cross-party. It has to be very long-term oriented. And the third one is the credibility of the industry. If we can't build on time, on budget, then the risk associated with our technology will mean that the financing is expensive. So today, what we have done is basically get organized ourselves, EDF. So we have completely reorganized our own team in nuclear. We have now 5 different teams. They are very segregated on delivering the project. But we also are bringing together all the ecosystem, as I said, both in France and in Europe, in order to make sure that we will be successful, we will de-risk, And by de-risking, then we will get the financing. But there is one thing I want to tell investors and the banks as well, is that for a long time, because we say renewable, people think it's sustainable. Misconception. There are bad ways to do renewable, as there are bad ways to do any energy system, right? The more renewable we get in the electric system, the more we see the negative externalities linked to it, okay? So we talk about biodiversity, about land, etc. So human rights, it's happening as well. So when we compare technology, let's be honest with each other about what are the externalities in both sides, okay? Because I can't, we talk about nuclear waste all the time, okay? The do not significant harm. I get it every single minute, right? But there are externalities everywhere. So let's deal with it so that we can have a proper evaluation of the level playing field of all this technology. And the last element is flexibility. Nuclear, and it's pretty obvious with the data centers and all the technology company coming, 24/7 electricity. This is also a price to pay, okay, compared to having the need to invest in flexibility. Because otherwise you pay 3 times. You pay for the intermittent capacity, you pay for the storage, and you pay for the curtailment. Negative prices in Europe, with the solar coming at the time when there is no demand, we know what it is today. There was a very good FT article on the number of hours that we have negative prices in Europe. So again, let's put the numbers, level playing field, and then we will see that the cost of nuclear is not exactly what people think when you add all of this together.
Do you think, just a quick follow-up, spontaneous applause here to that. Does that, I assume that one implication of this is that we ought to be doing much more careful life cycle analysis and talking about the full.
4 gram per kilowatt hour life cycle analysis of nuclear in France.
Including the footprint, the physical footprint
of
these facilities. So I want to go next to Chris. You run a company, Terrapower. It's one of many companies that's in the small modular reactor business, although I guess it depends on what you mean by the word small. And so I'm curious, how do you see, you've been here this morning, you're sitting next to folks who are working with light water reactor, conventional light water reactors. How do you see the role of the small modular reactor play in the overall tripling of nuclear story, and how are you going to pay for it?
Yeah, David, for sure we're going to see a mix of technologies, the large light water reactors, small modular reactors. For Terrapower, our approach started 18 years ago when Bill Gates founded the company with the premise that we needed to bring innovation to nuclear energy. When I joined Bill 10 years ago, I had worked for the nuclear Navy, I had worked for traditional nuclear companies, and I learned in coming to work for Bill that we didn't really innovate in nuclear. We had a lot of older designs that we hadn't really moved away from. So we believe there's great opportunity to be had with moving to advanced reactors like our natrium reactor. Because it's a low pressure plant and other features about it, it's going to consume about half the concrete, the steel, the labor hours per megawatt generated. We also believe it's not a tomorrow thing. In fact, arguably, natrium is America's next nuclear reactor. We broke ground in Wyoming in June at the site of a retiring coal plant. Bill Gates was there with us. We have a construction permit that is in front of the NRC right now, so we can start the non-nuclear parts of the plant. That's what we began in June. And then in 2026, we fully expect to have the nuclear construction permit to start the nuclear island. So we're out there just doing it, really. So I would love to talk more about the project, but it is a financing meeting here. And I want to talk about what's enabling us to move forward this aggressively with our project. I would say it's really about recognizing fair sharing of risk and reward, because if you listen to all of the discussions at meetings like this and others, a lot of folks are waiting for someone to move first, whether it's the banks with debt, with its investors, private or public, with its off-takers, whether they be public utilities or data centers. You really need to start with recognizing fair sharing of risk and reward in the long term. And so for us, that meant a couple things. We watched other projects that didn't succeed, projects that tried to put risk on regional ratepayers. It doesn't work. The dividends of these projects will not be realized by regional ratepayers. They should not pay for first-of-a-kind risks. So one of the reasons Pacific Corp, which is a Berkshire Hathaway company, is working with us is because we understood that from the beginning. We're building our first plant in partnership with them, and they have no exposure to first-of-a-kind cost. When that power is delivered to them and their customers, the power will be delivered at the value of the dispatchable electricity, not the price of our first plant. So that then shifts the investment to two other entities. One being our private investors will receive our dividend when we sell hundreds of these plants, which we totally believe will occur. The other big investor is the US government. We are, as John Podesta said, we received a very large grant, $2 billion US, via the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program. They're matching our private investors' spend dollar for dollar right now. And the dividend for the US government is a little different. It's not a financial return like our investors will receive, but it's renewed leadership in advanced nuclear energy, where China and Russia are arguably moving ahead of the US. It's reinvigoration of the supply chain. And it's the energy security that these new advanced reactors will bring. So for sure, we need the rest of the financial community to begin to come on board. Projects like, by the way, Mohamed Al-Hammadi is a board member of Terrapower. It's great to have his experience, really the only successful nuclear new build in the free world in the last decades. It's great to have Mohamed with his experience on our board. But we do need to recognize that these different financial parties are all going to need to have a risk that's commensurate with the reward. So we have to guide these projects. We have to recognize where they are, that sometimes they're too early for debt, sometimes they're too early for public markets investment. And we've seen several nuclear developers try SPACs too early, and they've really not raised enough. So I think a lot of it is about recognizing where you are in the process.
Quick follow-up on that, though. Give us your sense of what you expect. So you have basically Bill Gates and other investors and the US government are absorbing the risk for now for a larger public benefit, and then you have something like a contract for differences with your off-taker, and that reduces risk and it makes it look like a normal project and helps it finance. Do you have a sense, do you have to build 5 of these, 10 of these, 5,000 of these before they become normal projects?
Yeah, the DOE liftoff report was really pretty accurate, talking about learning curve and supply chain development. It's something on the order of 6 plants, but then you have to look at how are you transferring lessons learned from the first to the second.
To learn.
Yeah, and for us, supply chain development is huge. So right now, we're awarding the first procurement contracts to our suppliers. And at the same time we're doing that's really important, for one, because most nuclear supply chain partners aren't investing on the come, okay? They're waiting for that first order to make their tooling investments. So we're placing those orders, and at the same time, we're engaging in multi-unit supply chain discussions. So we're doing what, the older nuclear companies did in the 60s and 70s, reestablishing that supply chain.
And can you do that credibly? I mean, you can say we're going to build multiple, because they only see one project, or that remains to be seen.
Well, that's always a question, but and that's why it's important for them to see we really are taking the risk. We've mobilized the construction site. We're making tremendous regulatory progress. No one else in the U.S. has a construction license docketed in front of the NRC right now, so that arguably makes us next.
So I want to bring Peter Fried into this conversation. Peter, until recently you were head of energy strategy for Meta. You've been in the middle of this whole data center build out and so on. energy analysts for a long time have known that deep decarbonization means electrification, and we've been waiting for the growth in electric load because of deep decarbonization, and we're waiting. And then along comes the data center thing. And you've seen just incredible 25, 30% year-on-year growth. It's just extraordinary. Stefan Quist is in the audience, done a lot of work on this. And I'm just, do you see the purchasers of data center services as in effect the backbone then of financing new nuclear? And what's changed there?
So this is such a good question, and it's one that I spend a lot of time talking about and thinking about lately, as you might imagine. So I think there's a couple of different things that are worth discussing here, specifically related to time horizons. So, the big slug of data center load growth that everyone has been talking about right now is going to start in 2027, 2028. So projects which are breaking ground this year, the development time horizon is sort of 3 to 4 years for a typical data center. So, new plants in the United States aren't going to serve that load. So that's why we've seen things like the TMI restart, the Talon Susquehanna deal. Like, people are looking for opportunities to serve new facilities with clean, firm power. None of these solutions is necessarily perfect, but I think they're really important. And then we have all of these companies looking at every credible projection and model that they can see, saying, all right, by whatever the year is, I need clean, firm for everything. And nuclear energy really is the only technology, or at least the leading technology, that will provide the bulk of that. And so I think where the conversation is for these companies now, and what we've seen, I think probably the most obvious example is the Microsoft Google Nucor. They put out an RFP looking at more characteristic other technologies besides nuclear qualify, but nonetheless, really saying, here's where we need this to go. We're going to give you a market signal now that will help us get there. And so I do a lot of work right now with aggregated market signals, advanced market commitments, which we haven't necessarily seen in these space, but we've seen for things like technological carbon removal, where you have a market-making demand pull signal that says, all right, we're going to say, if you build it, we will be there, to the tune of quite a lot of demand. And how does that help people like Chris demonstrate to his investors, to the broader finance community, that we need to jumpstart things like supply chain and otherwise? So that thesis has been around for a while. This is what large buyers do, is they buy stuff, and they use those signals to then help unlock things like project financing and otherwise. But because this is a finance panel, I also want to just mention, I've been spending a lot of time recently with traditional large infrastructure investors, the biggest infrastructure investors in the United States. And what I am hearing over and over again is that demand signals aren't enough. And I think that that's quite an interesting conversation to be having. And so then we start hearing this, Chris hit it on the head, like, oh, you go first, you go first, you go first. And no one can quite figure this out. And so one of the things that's been very interesting to me is we take a general problem, oh, we need more money, and we start to dissect it and try to make it more specific. And I think that conversation for a room like this is really what would bear some additional thinking. What are the pinch points along the development time horizon for a first-of-kind plant, second-of-kind plant, all the way to nth-of-kind? Where can traditional pools of capital come in and provide the money that we know they can't? Like, one of the things that I've heard large investors in the United States say is, hey, once you're at COD, fine. Spigots are open, lots of money, no problem. So how do we go from where we are with, say, a Terrapower plant to a COD on such a plant? And where are the pinch points along the way? How much money is actually needed? What is the risk profile between today and that pinch point? And that's where I think maybe some non-traditional investing from folks like the data center companies could be deployed into the market. It is very true that they have lots of money. It is also true that because they have lots of money, everybody's now coming to them and saying, like, write the whole check, just do the whole thing. And it's just because they have a lot of money doesn't mean they spend it foolishly. So I think that conversation really needs to get more sophisticated than it currently is.
So there are a lot of people with lots of money, but there's something about the folks you work with, the data center, who are using these data center services, that has made them particularly open to the argument that comes out of all of our studies, that there's a difference between kilowatts and kilowatt hours. Clean, firm power is incredibly important. And is it because they're tech bros and they're excited about nuclear? Is it like nobody's wearing shoes and so they're all chill? What is it? about that industry that has made them willing to do, frankly, brave things? Because a lot of other industries have said, we think clean is synonymous with renewables, even though that's not true, and we're not going to, or we're going to put our heads in the sand, but your industry's done something different. Why?
You know, actually, the energy teams at these companies are very far from the tech bros. Actually, the energy team at Meta, for example, was a lot of former utility executives, some of the sharpest people in the energy industry, and they look at the math, they look at the models, they look at where we are today, and they look at where we need to be, and there just are only a few pathways that get us there. And so then they can begin to tell a more sophisticated story internally that, like, hey, look, the companies are willing to take big swings. These are swings that we need to start thinking about taking to meet the objectives that the company has set. And so those net zero, you know, it was RE100, now net zero is really the defining sustainability commitment that large companies are making. So if you want scope 2 net zero, that's electricity, you can't do it. You can't do it otherwise. And I think the other piece of it is a data center, for all intents and purposes, is a block load. Okay, so it runs all the time. And if you start thinking about matching of a block load with a generation profile, well, it's not a lot of things that can meet that. So I think those two things together are what has brought people to the point that they are today and will help bring that conversation forward. But it's always going to come from a place of sophistication, not from the perspective of like, oh, we got a really big checkbook and we're cool and barefoot and everything else. Like, we're just going to write checks for everything. Like, that doesn't work internally. And so to the
I think
extent
they don't use checks. It's actually Bitcoin now is the way they do it. It's all crypto. But I'm curious, I want to bring this back into the financing part of the discussion. You've been involved and watched closely the Susquehanna arrangements. We've now seen TMI restart with Microsoft. Are we going to see a lot of these? Are these going to become commonplace? Because there is this disconnect between the power demand that's here right now and therefore the need to use existing reactors. Mohamed's going to be serving a lot of these clients and then paying for all that. Should we see, are these just the beginning of a whole wave?
I think it is just the beginning of a whole wave for a couple of different reasons. One, if you go back to the ecosystem of the banks and the commitments that we have, how do we fulfill our commitments to the Net Zero Banking Alliance and that we are looking to decarbonize our lending portfolio? That truly can only be done in a handful of ways across industries. And it's not only within nuclear, it's how do we look at the entire ecosystem of what decarbonizing our lending portfolio looks like for the tech industry. And so if we have commitments that we are upholding within the tech industry, and we are holding our clients to those commitments as well, what does that mean when the lenders within your revolving credit facility may have to start drying up the liquidity due to the fact that certain of our clients are not making commitments within their corporate structure that enable us to decarbonize our lending portfolio? So I very much see this as a cycle, and it's not only the cycle within the sector that's related to nuclear, it's the cycle for the steel industry, right? We have commitments within all of the carbon-intensive industries that are very much going to be reliant on nuclear energy to meet their own commitments. So I go back to the financing is related to those commitments that we're making, but it's not only ours, it's holding our clients accountable to theirs and creating that incentivized chain, even internally amongst the bankers, right? It's great if you have commitments across an organization at a bank, but how are you measuring your investment bankers on achieving those commitments? Do you have the right incentives in place for the people who are on the ground? And are you able to enable them to have those challenging discussions with their clients on how their capital allocation is going to be impacted either positively or negatively on the financing side, but that also goes towards the bond side as well, which is an important topic that we discuss within the context of sustainable debt, green bonds. How do we create dialogue with the investor base? When we were working on various nuclear green bond deals, there were so many differing views among the investor base. And to this day, there still are investors who have made no public commitments on where is their stance on buying a nuclear green bond. If we had a handful of investors that came out and made a communication on, yes, for a nuclear green bond, we are supportive. And I'm sure EDF can speak to this better than I can, but how is that going to evolve over time?
And that's one of the big differences between this space where one creates a green bond, you're not sure whether nuclear is being seen as green, and the actual experience with many of the purveyors of the data center. Did you want to talk briefly about, because my impression is that the green bond world is a transient, that we're going to be moving in the direction of just bonds and other kinds of financial instruments. Is that how you see it, or is there a long tail to the green bond movement in nuclear?
For me, there is still a long tail of the green bond, to be honest. We did our first green bond in 2013. We were the first benchmark corporate green bond. We have 11.5 billion today. But the nuclear green bond is more recent because we had to have the taxonomy. So we have now 3 billion of nuclear green bond and 5.5 billion of green loans for nuclear. And Crédit Agricole was the first bank actually to publish on that. When we started in 2013, doing the use of proceeds green bond allowed us to bring investors which were not comfortable at the time with nuclear because our first green bond was only renewables, okay? So we had, Scandinavian, Swiss, German funds who bought the green bond because it was not touching nuclear, right? 10 years from now, because of all the things we mentioned about the fact that we are late in the net zero, we cannot not afford to use nuclear to reach the net zero, we start to see a lot more openness about coming to the nuclear green bonds. But the very, very big pushback that I get is the lack of greenium. It costs a lot internally to produce a green bond. I have to have an audit. I have to do environmental impact assessment. I get huge amount of work, and I get 4 basis point greenium. So this is a major problem, okay? But compared to sustainability-linked bonds, in my view, the green bond use of proceeds, at least, makes investors more comfortable on the impact reporting that they can have. If you just go back to plain bonds, you come back to the real credibility of the ESG assessment behind the scene. So I think there is ground for me for green bond to still be very big in the market.
I want to bring Mohamed in on this. I think one of the things that's very intriguing about your story is how the provision of huge volumes of reliable, zero-emission electricity has now inspired demand. And some of that demand is focused on markets that have border measures and so on, like the European market. I'm just curious, Mohamed, as you go to bankers now, previously you went and they had a long list of risks. Has the list gotten shorter? Has the list changed? And the reason I ask this question is because you've built something that can be exported to other countries. This model can be exported to other countries. Other countries can do what you've done in the Emirates. Is it now ready for prime time?
So I just want to maybe comment before I answer the question. And the answer is yes, but let me take it in a couple of steps. First of all, we are mixing in the discussion in the previous also panel between new reactors, which has never been built so far, and reactors that have been built, and reactors that have been built and has been operational. So been built and operational, yeah, bond is great, it's a great tool, and definitely we'll tap into that. And that's for bankers, for even whomever even lending their money to the bankers, they will feel safe. These are assets that generate a lot of cash and also save the environment at the same time. Going to next earlier step before operation, which is the construction phase, that's something need to be taken in a much more pragmatic way. When I say pragmatic means you need a single owner that can own all the risks and divide the risks to those different OEM supplier, to construction contractor, to a testing company and an operating company. This project goes a different profile of risk and different owners of risk or expert of risk that you have to manage and oversight. And that's my point of in a single point of accountability, oversighting this is very important. But we cannot mix super new technologies with mature technologies in one basket and talk about them in one gunshot. Doesn't work. We need to help the bankers, help the owners, help the clients who want to buy electricity. It will be delivered on time, will be delivered on budget, and the risk is managed and mitigated in a very intelligent way. And this is what we did in the UAE. We managed to break down the project and break the risk and manage the risk each differently for each phase of the project. This is it. We can communicate to either bankers or even talk to the government saying, this is how we are managing each phase of the project. Then you can bring momentum, you can bring kind of a coalition around you to make sure that project is successful. But to do it in a gunshot approach, or also go one step further, one step back, and overspend in some part of the project, which is unmanaged, could be balloon as a cost. And that's where expertise UAE can kind of bring it, to your point, that we've done a deal that is very well managed, and we reached a phase today which is operational, that is been managed the way that it is bankable. We did consult with Exim Bank, US Exim Bank, by the way, in the 2009 and 10 and 11. We've engaged with them, and they helped us a lot of their experience in the 80s. Well, what risks that are available, what risks we have to watch for, what is the best structure of maintaining and making sure every risk owner behaves the right behavior in delivering this project. Now, if I just one last message on financing, it is all about risk appetite. And to ask bankers or lenders to come and discuss and finance a project that's never been built, I would not recommend that any bank put the money there. But finding the risks that of first of a kind has been built, and Chris was talking about the Terrapower Natrium reactor being built, first of a kind, and the risk is being managed, and you see electrons coming from this reactor or steam coming from that reactor, then you can line up and you can put the money behind it and make it a reality. So in a nutshell, we need to make sure that we push the right projects or do the right projects at the right time and address the risk owners at the right time so they can get these projects done. And once you do it, the ultra scalers, they have serious demand. The demand for electricity for data centers, not just data centers, for industries, I think my colleague mentioned, is coming fast. The IEEE, by the way, did the latest study on electricity electrons forecast. By 2050, the future demand will be 3 times the current demand of electrons. And this is something huge. Will require all nuclear, all renewable, all fossil fuel to be able to meet that demand, which is huge.
Let me ask you, Chris, the vision that Mohamed laid out of building reactors at high excellence, low risk, big companies, integrated supply chains, EDF is doing this as well. That's a business for big companies. Meanwhile, almost everything that's interesting in terms of innovation in SMRs, that whole category that's kind of defined by what it's not big, is smaller companies. Do we have too many of them? Are there too many kind of Lilliputian shiny objects and we're not able to focus on the right ones? Or is that going to shake up pretty quickly?
David, we're an innovation company. We believe in ideas. We work for Bill Gates. He's funding so many different small companies to see which clean energy ideas can sustain themselves. So I don't think we need to talk about companies going away. It will just happen. To start a nuclear project, you start with kind of single-digit million spend, and then if you're serious, you're into the double, and then we're at triple-digit spend per quarter. So just to meet those gates, you're going to have to be ready to move that next step. So I think it's okay to have lots of players. They'll be put to the test. And I did want to pick up where Mohamed left off, that I guess advice for the financial community is to look at each project on its merits and try and characterize it. There's lots of great news right now with a few restarts of shut down nuclear plants. There's also going to be new nuclear capacity coming from power uprates. But we have to realize, those two steps are kind of low-hanging fruit. Compared to the demand, those are a very, very small percentage of the demand we see from data centers. So it's good those are proceeding. Those projects for restarts and power uprates are very bankable, whether it's with green bonds or just regular debt. Those projects are all bankable. And then maybe the next kind of easiest thing is plants like what Mohamed has proven out at Baraka, those large light water reactors. He's shown the learning curve. He's addressed the construction risk questions. That should be bankable too.
I think
But then if you look at SMRs though, and this is where an advanced technology like Natrium, we really think it's important to go to the advanced technology, okay? Because we think shrinking light water reactors is reverse economies of scale. This is where we think we really need innovation. And another reason we need innovation is because all of the SMRs are new, okay? Whether they're light water or new coolants, they all need a 1,000-person design. They all need to go through a licensing process. And that kind of spend is less bankable, probably looks more like equity. And again, what we've seen is the SPACs haven't done so well. It really takes some private investors to, who have long-term thinking. So, that's how I think the financial community needs to think about it is, what's bankable today. But for sure, the new builds are going to require equity. And again, our whole approach has been to get started, show people we're retiring regulatory risks, show people we're arranging our supply chain.
We have just a few more minutes. One of the things that happens in an industry that has a big Navy presence is that everything happens on time. Just a few more minutes in this panel. I want to try and get a couple more questions in. Peter, to you. This whole day is about financing, and therefore it's about risk and mitigating risk. Right now, we have in Ohio a regulatory proceeding that's advancing that's trying to assign more of the costs of expansion to the data centers, to the new load, kind of changing some of the precedent there. We have a challenge in place, and there will be other challenges around the constellation, around the Susquehanna behind the meter program, because that could affect the cost of electricity for others. Should we be looking now at these regulatory actions that are in effect trying to assign more costs to the rich kids who are buying this stuff? Should we view that as a new kind of risk that will raise the risks around new nuclear?
Look, super question. I think we are entering a moment where the regulatory paradigm and the utility business model is just going to need a little bit of rethinking. So it is 100% true that data centers are driving a lot of near-term demand growth, but also we just spent 2 years passing a whole host of federal legislation that incentivizes the electrification of everything, and it is working. So even in the most aggressive projections of data center build out, you're still low double-digit percentages of total domestic load. It's a near-term thing. We have to focus on it, but it's not the only thing. We are also in a moment domestically where many investor-owned utilities are facing a real and immediate revenue constraint. Rates are too high. It will be challenging to go higher. It will be challenging to put additional assets into rate base. So what do we do in that circumstance? If you are going to direct assign the costs of new build generation to individual customer classes, never mind whether that's discriminatory or not, it is going to be increasingly challenging to justify a return on equity on those assets if they are singularly benefiting individual customers who may also like to see the benefits associated with contributing to the development of those plants.
Yeah,
so I think the time is coming where we've got to figure some of this out. I don't think it looks the way it's looked before. However, yeah, it is reasonable to think about new ways of financing the deployment of advanced energy technologies or new generation full stop to accommodate the load growth that we know is coming.
Yeah, I mean, it's a reminder of what Carine said earlier, which is we have to articulate better the benefit story and the allocation of those benefits, otherwise the politics will come unglued. I want just one last question, and I want to pick up on something Mohamed said earlier, which is the secret sauce has been policy stability and reliability and high confidence. I want to just quickly ask Romina and Carine very quickly. Both of you mentioned the EU framework, the EU taxonomy. I was stunned by that because, not that you mentioned it, but that here we had a jurisdiction that was all renewables all the time, and then now we've got nuclear, nice things being said about nuclear. What should the rest of the world learn about the success there that could help improve policy support for nuclear in the rest of the world?
In my opinion, what we can learn from the EU taxonomy and the integration of nuclear is once you have that widespread adoption, it gives comfort to the other market players. So what did we see immediately after the day that nuclear was included in the EU taxonomy? You better believe that the bankers were picking up their phones and saying, this is the time. We have to start actively pitching nuclear green bonds. And it's not to say we weren't doing it before, but once you have that comfort via the form of a taxonomy, or it can be another taxonomy in another area of the world, then there is that comfort. It is challenging in certain spaces to be a first mover. That was mentioned on the panel. So what is it going to take? What is really the next catalyst for these industry players on the bank side and the investor side?
And that's the big shift, is this is now becoming normal and comfortable and expanding. So please, before the voice of God yanks me from the stage, please join me in thanking our terrific panel.